Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The words cut through the September morning, sharp and venomous, and Judge Kesha Williams knew they would follow her long after the bruise faded. They weren't just words spat by a bitter man. They were the embodiment of the very rot she had spent her career fighting. She had dressed simply that day, navy slacks, a cream blouse, no robe, no badge of honor that marked her as the Honorable Judge K. Williams. Just a woman on her way to work, briefcase tucked under her arm, files neatly stacked, ready to preside over another full docket. She expected debates, motions, maybe an afternoon trial. She did not expect Officer Martinez. He blocked the steps, eyes narrowing as he sized her up. To him, she wasn't a jurist, wasn't an officer of the court, just another black face in the wrong place. His sneer curled like a blade, and before she could speak, his open palm cracked across her cheek. The sound was obscene in its clarity. Papers exploded from her briefcase, fluttering across the courthouse steps like shredded confetti at a parade no one wanted. Her head snapped sideways, the sting blooming hot across her jaw. Martinez didn't stop. He gripped her throat, shoving her against the stone wall hard enough for her teeth to clatter. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages," he hissed again, as if repetition could make the lie true. He wrenched her arms behind her back, snapping cold metal cuffs around her wrists until they bit into flesh. Laughter echoed, not the laughter of strangers caught off guard, but the familiar chuckle of colleagues. Other officers gathered, phones raised, capturing her humiliation like a cheap spectacle. Each smirk, each glint of amusement carved deeper into her resolve. Her jaw throbbed, but she refused to drop her gaze. Instead, her eyes fixed on the bronze plaque above the courthouse entrance. The Honorable Judge K. Williams, presiding. 20 feet away, her nameplate glistened in morning light, mocking the absurdity of the moment. She had spent her life serving the system, and now that very system brutalized her on its own front steps. Inside, the script flipped. Martinez straightened. His uniform ran a hand over his badge and smoothed his expression into one of authority. He had done this before: spin the story, control the narrative, cast himself as protector and his victim as the threat. The court was his stage, and the system always cheered for the hero in blue. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady, practiced, almost soothing. "I was conducting routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured casually toward the defendant's table, where Judge Williams sat shackled like a common criminal, a purple bruise blossoming across her cheek. The contrast between her dignity and her restraints was almost unbearable. The defendant was acting erratically, Martinez continued, refused to provide identification, and grew increasingly hostile when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Harrison, a pale, frail man in his 60s, temporarily filling in for docket overflow, nodded with indulgent approval. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Martinez?" Martinez's eyes gleamed. He warmed to his own fabrication. "Well, sir, she was dressed inappropriately for court, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents. When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats." From the gallery, Officers Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged glances. They had heard this script before. Different faces, same story. Martinez's. Her confidence never wavered. His lies had always been believed. She kept insisting she was someone important, he said, with a mocking tilt of his head. A lawyer, a judge, a senator, anything to avoid accountability. They always play that card. Judge Harrison leaned forward, engaged now. Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest? Absolutely. Martinez nodded firmly. The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety. The only betrayal of nerves was a faint tremor in his hand. His words, however, landed flawlessly. The stenographer's keys clattered, immortalizing every lie in cold transcript. In the back row, a young law clerk frowned. Something in her memory whispered that the woman in handcuffs was no stranger to this courtroom, but doubt was easy to suppress when the uniform spoke with authority. The prosecutor rose. "Officer Rodriguez, can you corroborate Officer Martinez's testimony?" Rodriguez stood, uniform immaculate. "Yes, ma'am, I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant clearly attempted to circumvent security protocols. Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Harrison inquired. Martinez's jaw tightened, but his tone never faltered. "Your Honor, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive individual. Any injuries she sustained were the result of her own resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently began in the middle of the scuffle. "I have partial footage here, though unfortunately my body camera malfunctioned this morning." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. "How convenient," Kesha murmured. It was the first time she had spoken. "I'm sorry?" Judge Harrison raised a brow. "Nothing, Your Honor." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with controlled fury. Martinez pressed on, certain of victory. "What we're seeing is another case of someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing, carrying suspicious documents, and when confronted, she immediately claimed discrimination." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, nodded gravely. "Officer Martinez, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations?" "Unfortunately, yes. There's a pattern. Certain individuals think they're above the law. They accuse officers of racism to deflect from their crimes. It's insulting to real victims of discrimination." His voice rose with righteous indignation. Several in the gallery nodded in agreement, their faces mirroring headlines they had seen on the news. The story felt familiar, comfortable, believable. Martinez smirked. This defendant even claimed she was going to work, but she had no identification, no employment verification, no legitimate reason to be in a restricted area. Officer Thompson added, "If I may, Your Honor, she was carrying confidential legal documents. We suspect identity theft or fraud." "Fraud?" Judge Harrison looked intrigued. "Yes, sir," Martinez seized the moment. "Documents with judicial letterhead, sensitive case numbers. No legitimate citizen would have such access. We believe she intended to impersonate court personnel." The irony was suffocating, but Martinez pressed forward, unaware of the trap tightening around him. "In my professional opinion, this is simply another case of someone gaming the system. She wants to make it about race, about alleged police brutality, when really she's distracting from her crimes. These people think they can waltz into any courtroom, any space they please, and when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well," he turned, staring coldly at Kesha, "not in my courthouse." The words hung like a poisonous cloud. Some staff shifted uncomfortably, others stayed stone-faced. The prosecutor closed her file with satisfaction. "The state recommends charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on an officer. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly without merit." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, the gavel poised to fall. And in that suffocating silence, Judge Kesha Williams sat chained before the very system she had upheld, forced to watch the machinery of injustice spin around her, her nameplate gleaming just outside the door, her truth buried under polished lies. For Martinez, it was another performance. For Kesha, it was the betrayal of everything she believed justice to be. And for the system, it was just another day. Martinez allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The case was unfolding exactly as he intended. Another easy win, another example of the system working the way it always had. People either knew their place or they learned it the hard way. His testimony had landed, the prosecutor had nodded, in all the right places, and the gallery seemed comfortably aligned with the story he had told. Confident, he leaned into the narrative one final time. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Martinez said, his voice steady with false humility, "I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used significantly more force." Judge Harrison gave him a grave nod. "Your professionalism is noted, Officer Martinez." In the defendant's chair, Kesha Williams sat perfectly still. Her cuffed hands rested lightly in her lap, her posture erect, her face calm. But those watching closely, very few of them might have seen the faintest curve at the corners of her mouth. Not a smile of amusement, but one of resolve. Every word Martinez spoke was etched into her memory, each fabrication carefully, catalogued, soon to be used against him. He had no idea he was testifying before the very woman with the authority, knowledge, and courage to dismantle his career. "Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer?" Judge Harrison asked. Martinez straightened his shoulders, projecting authority. "Only that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it is backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic his own words would prove to be." The prosecutor smiled with quiet confidence. "The state rests, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and resistance to lawful authority." Martinez stepped down from the witness stand, his boots echoing across the courtroom floor. As he passed the defendant's table, he allowed himself one last act of cruelty. He caught Kesha's eye and winked, a gesture of dominance, a promise that she was crushed beneath his power. It was, though he did not know it, the last taste of victory he would ever have in his career. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Harrison said. His tone carried the weight of inevitability, as if this moment was a mere formality before the gavel came down. Slowly, Kesha rose. The handcuffs rattled softly with her movement. Her blouse was rumpled, her cheek bruised purple, but the way she carried herself commanded attention. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably under the force of her composure. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, firm, and utterly controlled. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Judge Harrison blinked. He had expected pleading, maybe indignation, perhaps even incoherent rambling. What he heard instead was authority, measured, practiced, and powerful. "First, I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Martinez's testimony," she continued, her eyes moving deliberately across the courtroom, settling momentarily on each person who had nodded along with his lies. "According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the courthouse entrance at approximately 8:47 this morning." Her gaze locked on Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with Hague versus Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums, where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before resuming. The prosecutor's brow furrowed. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate defendant. This was someone who knew the law, and knew it well. "Furthermore," Kesha said, gesturing lightly toward the evidence table where her scattered files had been gathered, "Officer Martinez testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested involvement in identity theft. Let us examine that claim more closely. Those documents are indeed authentic. They include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, materials to which I have legitimate access in my professional capacity. Judge Harrison leaned forward. And what exactly is your profession, Miss Williams? A pause, the faintest upturn of her lips. Dr. Williams, she corrected softly, and I think we'll get to my professional background shortly. Martinez, sitting rigid now, felt the first chill crawl up his spine. If I may continue, Kesha said, her voice steady and precise. Officer Martinez also claimed that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I will invoke my Fifth Amendment right regarding any statements I may or may not have made. However, I will note that any remarks were in direct response to being physically assaulted, without provocation, without warning, and without legal justification. In the back row, the young law clerk sat straighter. The cadence of her speech, the comfort with which she cited precedent, the measured confidence in every phrase, it tugged at recognition. And now, regarding the alleged body cam malfunction, Kesha continued, steel entering her tone. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of summaries of voluminous records. I have reason to believe comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court. Judge Harrison's interest sharpened. What kind of evidence are you referring to? This courthouse is equipped with high-definition surveillance cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach, Kesha explained. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions. Martinez's face blanched. In his rush to control the narrative, he had forgotten the most obvious fact. He had assaulted her in full view of multiple courthouse cameras. I would like to request formally, Kesha said, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance from this morning between 8:45 and 9:05 a.m., including courthouse security footage, body cam backups, and any mobile phone recordings made by officers present. Prosecutor Walsh shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper representation. Kesha turned to face her, eyes like tempered glass. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence under the Sixth Amendment. Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland requires the prosecution to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The courtroom went utterly still. This was not how cases like this unfolded. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Miss Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor, she said evenly. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes glinted with the promise of revelation. She moved toward the evidence table as far as the chains would allow and pointed to a folder among her belongings. And as for Officer Martinez's claim that I was suspicious or unauthorized, this is my daily court calendar. It lists today's docket. Her finger tapped the bold lettering at the top of the page. The Honorable Judge K. Williams, Courtroom 3B. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, but now it served a different purpose. It was no longer a mark of humiliation. It was evidence, a reminder of what she had endured, and a symbol of the fight she was about to lead. She squared her shoulders and looked Henderson in the eye. "Announce me properly," she repeated. When they re-entered the courtroom, the energy shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence, eyes widened, and even Judge Harrison's gavel nearly slipped from his hand. The doors opened, and Henderson's voice boomed with the gravity of 12 years of service. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Martinez froze, his smirk evaporating as if wiped away by an unseen hand. His confident swagger faltered into disbelief. Kesha walked with deliberate calm, her robes flowing behind her like a tide reclaiming its shoreline. The gavel in her hand gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. She took her seat at the bench, her bench, and looked down upon the room with the steady gaze of authority returned. "Please be seated," she said. The room obeyed. Judge Harrison stammered, his voice cracking. "Judge W. Williams, I wasn't informed." "That much is clear," Kesha replied, her voice steady but laced with quiet steel. "I will be taking over these proceedings." The prosecutor shifted nervously, papers trembling in her hands. Officer Martinez's face had drained of color. He no longer looked like a man in control, but like prey that had just realized the hunter had been beside him all along. Kesha lifted the credential wallet she had shown moments before and placed it gently on the bench. "For the record," she said, her words measured and deliberate, "I am the Honorable Judge Kesha Williams, presiding judge of this courthouse. For the past 23 years, this morning I was assaulted, unlawfully detained, and falsely accused by Officer Martinez, aided by the perjured testimony of Officers Rodriguez and Thompson." The silence was suffocating. Her eyes swept over the gallery, locking briefly with each face. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the floor, ashamed. "Let the record reflect," she continued, "that every word of testimony given by Officer Martinez this morning was false. Furthermore, I'm ordering immediate retrieval of courthouse surveillance footage between the hours of 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., along with all backup body camera files from the officers present." Martinez shot to his feet. "Objection! This is irregular. This is—" Kesha fixed him with a stare so sharp he fell silent mid-sentence. "Sit down, officer. You are not in command here." Henderson, standing loyally by the door, moved one hand toward his radio. Martinez hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat. The tremor in his hands betrayed him. Kesha rapped her gavel once, the sound echoing like thunder. "Effective immediately, I am recusing Judge Harrison from further oversight of this matter. I will preside." Harrison opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He shrank into his chair, pale and silent. "Now," Kesha said, turning to the prosecutor, "you may withdraw your charges against me, or you may proceed and risk sanctions for prosecutorial misconduct. Choose carefully." The prosecutor swallowed hard. "The state withdraws, Your Honor." "Noted," Kesha replied, and her gavel struck again. Then she turned back to Martinez, who now sat rigid, his jaw clenched, every ounce of confidence gone. "Officer Martinez," she said, her voice cold and precise, "you claim that some people only understand authority when it is backed by force. You were right about one thing. Actions do have consequences, and you are about to face yours." The gallery erupted into whispers, tension breaking like glass, but Kesha's voice cut cleanly through the noise. "This court will convene a special hearing to determine the extent of perjury, assault, and abuse of authority committed here. Today, bailiff, take officers Martinez, Rodriguez, and Thompson into custody pending investigation." The three officers stiffened as Henderson and two deputies moved forward. Martinez began to protest, but his words came out garbled, panicked, stripped of their earlier swagger. "You can't, this isn't legal," he stammered as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, this time biting into his own skin instead. "Of hers." Kesha leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "It's called justice, officer. Perhaps it's unfamiliar to you." The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Martinez, the man who had strutted and lied with such confidence less than an hour earlier, was led away in chains. And in that silence, as Judge Kesha Williams rapped her gavel once more, the sound was not just the closing of a hearing. It was the sound of a system cracking open, forced to face the corruption it had long ignored. "I've been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Martinez," Kesha said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Every case you've testified in, every warrant you've requested, every search you've conducted, each one now stands under the shadow of perjury and corruption. The words hit harder than any gavel. Martinez swayed as if the floor itself had shifted beneath him. His career wasn't just unraveling, it was imploding live, in the very courthouse where he had once strutted like a king. Kesha leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving him. "You see, Officer Martinez, authority is not brute force. It is not intimidation, nor is it cruelty dressed up in a badge and a uniform. Authority is rooted in law, and law requires truth. Something you abandoned the moment you put your hands on me." The gallery, what remained of it, sat frozen. Even the prosecutor had stopped pretending to shuffle papers, her pen dangling from her hand. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see just how far this reckoning would go. "Bailiff Henderson," Kesha said evenly. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice cracked slightly, but he stood straighter than he had in years. "Take Officer Martinez into custody, effective immediately. Charges will include felony assault on a federal judge, obstruction of justice, falsifying testimony under oath, and conspiracy with fellow officers to commit perjury." Martinez exploded. "You can't do this. This is my life, my job, my—" Kesha slammed her gavel down, the crack echoing like thunder through the chamber. "Silence, officer. You had your chance to speak the truth. Instead, you chose lies, violence, and humiliation. Now you will learn what accountability feels like." Two deputies closed in. Martinez tried to resist, jerking his arms back, but Henderson shoved him firmly against the prosecutor's table. The sound of handcuffs clinking shut around his wrists was the final punctuation to his reign of impunity. "And as for Officers Rodriguez and Thompson," Kesha continued, turning her eyes toward the men who had backed Martinez's lies, "you swore under oath that Officer Martinez conducted himself with professionalism. The record and the video evidence say otherwise. You will both be held on suspicion of perjury, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Bailiff, see to it." The two officers froze, their bravado gone, their skins slick with sweat. When deputies moved toward them, neither resisted. The weight of evidence was too overwhelming. Kesha let the silence stretch a moment longer before she spoke again, her voice steady, almost surgical. "This courthouse is a house of law, not a stage for brutality. What happened this morning is not just a crime against me. It is a crime against the people this institution serves. It is a reminder of how easily justice can be corrupted when we allow prejudice and arrogance to rule in place of truth." She set her gavel down gently and folded her hands. "But let this also be the moment the tide turns, because here, today, justice has returned." For the first time since the chaos began, the gallery stirred, not with fear or gossip, but with something heavier, something reverent. A few stood to their feet quietly, instinctively, as though bearing witness to history. Martinez dragged toward the holding cells he had once marched others into, shouted weakly over his shoulder. "This isn't over. You think they'll back you after this? You think the system cares?" Kesha's eyes narrowed. "The system doesn't care, officer, but the law does, and so do I." Her gavel struck once more. "Court is adjourned." The sound carried with it the weight of finality, a judgment not just against Martinez, but against the rot that had festered for years unchecked. What remained now was not silence, but a sense of reckoning, as though every stone in the courthouse walls had just witnessed the truth finally, defiantly, reclaim its place. "Unsubstantiated," Judge Williams finished for him, her tone razor-sharp. She closed the file with a deliberate snap that made Martinez flinch. "That word appears in nearly every single report connected to your name. 47 complaints, 47 denials, 47 times this department decided that the community's word meant less than yours. But today, Officer Martinez, the evidence speaks for itself. And unlike those 47 people you silenced, I am in a position to ensure your voice cannot bury the truth again." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every clerk, every bailiff, every attorney who had once laughed or whispered their doubts about Judge Williams's authority now sat rigid, staring at the fallen officer like he was a specimen under glass. Martinez's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but even he seemed to understand that no defense could withstand the storm building behind the bench. Judge Williams opened the file once more, her eyes scanning the pages. Complaint number 31. A young mother named Aisha Bennett alleged that you struck her across the face in front of her children during a noise disturbance call. You wrote in your report that she was hysterical and aggressive. The investigation cleared you, of course, and yet... She tapped the tablet and played a short clip, grainy but clear enough to show a terrified woman shielding her children while Martinez raised his hand. The courtroom winced. Martinez buried his face in his hands. She let the image hang before advancing again. Complaint number 39. Samuel Carter, a decorated veteran, claimed that you called him a disgrace and threw him to the ground during a traffic stop. Once again, your department protected you, and once again the evidence tells a different story. Another clip played. Body cam footage that had been buried until the federal investigation unearthed it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Williams set the tablet aside and leveled her gaze at Martinez. Do you see the pattern here? You believed your badge was a shield, that it granted you permission to dehumanize the very people you swore to protect. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable because for 15 years no one did. But accountability has arrived, Officer Martinez, and it is long overdue. Martinez's chest heaved. His eyes darted toward the exit, but two federal marshals had already stepped quietly into place. There would be no escape. The judge straightened, her robes falling in perfect lines. I want this record to reflect that Officer Daniel Martinez is hereby remanded into federal custody pending formal charges, including but not limited to felony assault on a federal judge, perjury, civil rights violations under color of law, and obstruction of justice. This court will also be forwarding all evidence of departmental misconduct to the Department of Justice for immediate review. She raised her gavel and paused, her eyes scanning the room once more. For years, this courthouse has allowed the word unsubstantiated to erase the pain of citizens who came here seeking justice. That ends today. Let the record show that in this courtroom, truth still matters, and let it be known that power abused is power lost. The gavel struck like thunder. The room erupted, not in applause, but in stunned, reverent silence. Lawyers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Court clerks whispered into each other's ears, unable to believe what they had witnessed. Reporters who had slipped in during the commotion scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would reverberate across the country. And Officer Martinez, once so smug and untouchable, now sat slumped and broken, his badge no longer a shield but the evidence of his downfall. His whispered protest, "I didn't know," still hung in the air, pitiful and empty, a reminder that ignorance is no defense when justice finally calls your name. Judge Williams set her gavel aside and folded her hands. Court is adjourned. "You're beginning to see a pattern here?" Judge Williams asked, her tone sharp as a blade. At some point during the proceedings, Chief Judge Margaret Carter had slipped into the courtroom and now sat in the front row, her expression grim, pen scratching across a legal pad as she recorded every word. "But here's what's really interesting, Officer Martinez," Williams continued. "I cross-referenced your complaint record with your arrest statistics. Some fascinating patterns emerged." She pulled a large chart from behind the bench and placed it on an easel where the entire gallery could see. Picking up a laser pointer, she began to highlight sections. Over your 15-year career, you've made 1,152 arrests. Of those, 1,089, 87%, involved people of color. Yet the demographics of your patrol area are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. Even more disturbing, your use of force reports show that you deployed physical force in 63% of arrests involving people of color, compared to just 12% of arrests involving white suspects. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery. Martinez's attorney scribbled furiously, likely preparing to argue diminished capacity or insanity. Judge Williams set down the laser pointer and held up another document. And here's perhaps the most damning statistic of all. Of your 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or violations of constitutional rights. That is a dismissal rate of nearly 40%. Do you know what we call it when an officer's arrests collapse under constitutional violations nearly half the time? She leaned forward, her eyes locked on him. We call it a pattern of criminal behavior. The courtroom fell silent, but for the furious scratching of reporters' pens. But wait, she said, her voice almost conversational now. There's more. She held up another sheet of paper. I've also reviewed the financial impact of your career on the taxpayers of this county. Over the past 15 years, this county has paid out $2.3 million in settlements and judgments tied directly to your misconduct. $2.3 million. That's more than the annual budget of some small towns. Martinez's face had gone slack. His lips moved, dry and soundless, before he finally managed a croaking protest. Your Honor, I was just doing my job. Your job? Judge Williams cut him off. She reached for a folded document. Let me remind you of the oath you swore the day you put on that badge. She unfolded the paper and read aloud, her voice ringing across the chamber. I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office according to the best of my ability. So help me God. She lowered the paper. Faithfully and impartially, Officer Martinez, not selectively, not based on skin color, not twisted to fit your prejudices. She stepped from behind the bench, her robes flowing like armor, and turned to address the packed courtroom. What we are witnessing here is not the behavior of one rogue officer. This is the inevitable product of a system that shields men like Martinez. A system that dismisses complaint after complaint, that pays settlement after settlement, all while allowing abuse to continue unchecked. But that system failed you today, didn't it, Officer Martinez? Because today, you chose to assault someone who had the power to expose it all. Martinez dropped his head into his hands. This morning, Williams went on, her voice tightening, you told this court that people like me needed to learn our place. Well, Officer Martinez, it's time you learned yours. She returned to the bench and lifted her gavel. Your place is in the defendant's chair, facing the full consequences of 15 years of criminal behavior. The gavel came down with a crack that reverberated through the chamber. The air itself seemed to change. Everyone in the gallery, attorneys, clerks, staff, reporters, leaned forward. Breath held. They knew they were witnessing history. Williams's eyes swept the room, then fell back on Martinez, who sat slumped and gray, his life unraveling before him. Officer Martinez, she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. Before I render judgment, I want to address not just you, but everyone here, and everyone who will hear about this case. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when a man with a badge believes he is above the law? What happens when unchecked power and systemic protection create someone so arrogant that he assaults a federal judge on her own courthouse steps, convinced there will be no consequences? Her voice rose, resonant, undeniable. The answer, Officer Martinez is standing before you right now. She picked up her gavel again, the one engraved on the day of her appointment with the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." The gold inlay caught the light as she held it aloft. For 15 years, you have terrorized this community. For 15 years, you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years, you have turned the badge into a weapon of fear rather than a shield of protection. But your greatest mistake wasn't any single act of brutality. It was believing the system would always protect you. It was believing that power abused could never be called to account. Martinez finally looked up, his eyes red, his voice a whisper. "Your Honor." Williams's words cut through him like steel. "This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse and paraded me in handcuffs like a criminal, you thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim. But I was never powerless, Officer Martinez, and neither were the people you brutalized. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness." The gallery stirred, the air electric. Williams straightened to her full height. "Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, your own words, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum of 5 years. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for lying under oath in this very room." The words fell like hammer blows. Martinez's attorney dropped his pen and covered his face with both hands. "But Officer Martinez," Williams said, her voice softening though it lost none of its power, "this case was never truly about you. You are a symptom of a deeper disease that has poisoned our justice system for too long. That disease ends here, in this courtroom, today." The gavel came down one final time. "For too long," Judge Williams declared, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the packed courtroom. "We've allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, complaints have been dismissed, evidence ignored, and taxpayers forced to foot the bill for settlements, while abuse continued unchecked. For too long, victims of police brutality have been told their experiences don't matter, that their words carry no weight, that justice was never meant for them." Her voice grew stronger, rising like a tide. "But that ends today. What happened in this courtroom proves beyond any doubt that no one, no police officer, no prosecutor, no judge, no politician is above the law. No one." The room was so still it seemed time itself had paused. Suddenly, Officer Martinez broke down, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. His voice cracked, a whisper lost in the cavernous silence. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant—" Williams regarded him, her eyes cool but not entirely devoid of compassion. "Your apology, Officer Martinez, is 15 years and 47 complaints too late. Your remorse has surfaced only because, for the first time in your life, you have been caught, and caught by someone with the authority to hold you accountable." She lifted her gavel high, the engraved words glinting under the courtroom lights. "But understand this. Every grandmother you mocked, every teenager you framed, every doctor you humiliated, every citizen you brutalized deserved the same justice I'm delivering today. You denied them that justice. I will not deny it any longer." The gavel hovered in the air like a blade poised for the final stroke. "Today, I deliver justice not only for myself, but for every voice silenced, every complaint dismissed, every family forced to watch while the system turned its back. You told me to know my place. Well, here is my place, ensuring that bullies like you never again hide behind a badge to destroy innocent lives." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. "Officer Martinez, you are hereby sentenced to the Maximum penalty allowed by law, 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Martinez collapsed, his sobs now uncontrollable, his career, his reputation, and his freedom obliterated in an instant. But Williams was not finished. "Furthermore," she said, her tone steady, unyielding, "I am ordering a federal investigation into every case you have touched, every arrest you have made, and every complaint filed against you. The victims you silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court." She set the gavel down, her voice now carrying the weight of history. "Let this be a message to every officer, every prosecutor, every official who thinks power shields them from consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and eventually she comes for everyone." The courtroom erupted. Applause thundered, rolling on for 5 full minutes, a cathartic roar from a community long denied its voice. For the first time in years, justice had not only been served, it had been seen. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that morning had transformed the justice system itself. Officer Martinez sat in a federal prison cell, stripped of his badge, his pension, his dignity, his freedom. Once feared, he now lived in protective custody, learning firsthand the meaning of powerlessness. His fall was headline news, but his story was only the beginning. The investigation Judge Williams ordered unearthed a web of corruption that reached deep into the police department's command structure. 12 officers were terminated, 4 supervisors indicted on federal charges, and the entire department placed under strict federal oversight. Chief Judge Margaret Carter established sweeping reforms: automatic federal review of every case involving allegations of police misconduct against judicial officers, mandatory tamper-proof body cameras with backup systems, and a whistleblower protection program that empowered officers and citizens alike to report abuse without fear. Most importantly, the 432 cases Martinez had poisoned were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants walked free. Hundreds of charges were dropped or sentences reduced. Families reunited, lives began to rebuild. The county, forced to reckon with the magnitude of Martinez's crimes, paid an additional $8.7 million in compensation, funds pulled directly from the police department's budget rather than the taxpayers. Judge Williams herself became a national symbol of integrity and courage. She spoke at law schools, judicial conferences, and civil rights forums, always delivering the same message: justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered belongs to everyone. The courthouse, where it all unfolded, was renamed the Justice Williams Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque near the entrance bore a simple inscription: "Here, justice finally found its voice." The community itself was transformed. Citizens who once feared reporting police misconduct now stepped forward in record numbers. Community oversight. Boards were established. Training programs were rebuilt from the ground up, with Judge Williams herself helping design curricula on constitutional rights, racial bias, and the true meaning of public service. The young law clerk who had watched the proceedings that fateful day pursued a career in civil rights law, joining the ACLU to fight systemic injustice nationwide. As for Officers Rodriguez and Thompson, the men whose laughter was caught on body cam as Martinez brutalized a federal judge, they were terminated and charged federally with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Their smug voices, once dismissive of accountability, now played in classrooms at police academies across the country as a warning of what happens when silence enables corruption. The video of Judge Williams delivering her verdict became one of the most watched courtroom recordings in history, with over 50 million views online. Messages poured in from around the globe, from people who had endured similar abuses but had never witnessed such decisive accountability. And so, Officer Martinez remained in his cell, perhaps reflecting on the morning he mistook a black woman for someone powerless, not realizing she was power itself. He thought he knew his place. He thought he knew hers. He was wrong on both counts, because sometimes justice does not just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice strikes back. Never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies. Never forget that justice, though delayed, always finds its way home.